Hello, Canada Files viewers. This is Aiden Jonah, editor-in-chief of the Canada Files. I am here with José Luis Granados Ceja. He is a journalist and anti-imperialist. He is based in Mexico City, covers Mexico and Latin America, and he's a staff writer for Venezuela Analysis. Thanks for coming on.
Absolutely happy to be here.
Well, Mexico, Canada, this region, we have so much to talk about. But let's start with something that people probably won't pay as much attention to. Mexico, Canada, America, and genetically modified corn. So, why did Mexico first restrict the use of GM corn, and how exactly did these restrictions work?
Yeah, so right now we are in the Claudia Sheinbaum government. Claudia Sheinbaum is very much the successor to Andrés Manuel López Obrador, elected in 2018. Landmark election, really a watershed moment for Mexico. And Claudia Sheinbaum very much represents a continuity of that. I mentioned that because I think it's really important to stress that she, in a lot of ways, is representative of the political project here known as the Fourth Transformation of Mexico. And this issue is actually something that comes from the previous government, from Andrés Manuel López Obrador. So this is something that came up because people may not be aware, but Mexico is the country among the highest consumption of corn. But that corn is actually largely imported from the United States, which is extraordinary because in a lot of ways you could say that corn comes from here. And that happened as a result of the free trade agreement. It's a product of neoliberal policies from the 90s that largely abandoned the countryside, leading to mass migration to the cities, mass migration out of Mexico, and obviously a situation where it was no longer sustainable to live in the countryside, and therefore a drop in production that was replaced with genetically modified corn from the United States. Some for non-human consumption, that is to say, so it's used for animal, for feed and stuff like that, but some it does also used for human consumption. And the reason that Lopez Obrador moved on this is, on the one hand, the symbolic importance of corn for the Mexican people. Like I said, we're amongst the highest consumers, if not the highest consumers of corn per capita in the entire world. It's a major part of the diet. You know, there's a tortilleria on every corner in every neighborhood of Mexico City where I live, and that's true of most of the country as well. Although in the north they eat more flour tortillas, but that's okay because they have a different diet than us here in the central and the south. And so part of it was because of there are very genuine concerns around genetically modified corn, and in particular, the corn that is sold by major transnational companies, which, in addition to being genetically modified, it's not about being anti-science, but it's actually the glyphosate, all of the other kind of issues that come along with genetically modified corn, and in particular around the fact that sometimes it's sort of these self killing seeds that are not sustainable. And of course, the other one is protecting native corn, protecting that which comes from this land. And so Lopez Obrador actually proposed this, and there was a lot of pushback almost immediately because it is a major export of very important producers inside the United States who use their influence and their political power that they have through, U.S. representatives and the trade commissions, et cetera, the embassy, to say that to stop. And in fact, what first happened was there was a restriction of the feed for humans and then, or sorry, the corn for humans and then subsequently feed as well. Now, this was taken to a panel. This was taken to a panel because Mexico is part of the North American Free Trade Agreement, now known as TEMEC here in Mexico, CUMSA in Canada. And arguing that this decision wasn't scientifically based and therefore they shouldn't be allowed to go down this path. And ultimately, that is what happened. But now we are in the Claudia Sheinbaum government, and she's now having to take on this fight. And she's been very clear. Okay, you want to stop us from being able to ban genetically modified corn? We're going to make it a constitutional amendment, and nothing is above the Constitution. Even these trade agreements, although they would argue that they are, right? It's likely going to be litigated for a while, but nonetheless, the message is sent. This government is going to do what it needs to do to protect native corn and to resist the penetration of these different genetically modified varieties, which present a danger to the countryside, their ability to be sustainable, to live sustainably off of the land, which is part of the political project here, is to get people to live in the countryside again, to have the supports necessary to do it, and also to protect maíz criollo, we say, native corn here in Mexico.
All right, so I actually was in Mexico for about 2 weeks around the end of the year. So I got to see some of the side, Querétaro, San Miguel de Allende, beautiful places. And one of the things I saw was They had the murals. The distinctive kind of thing was they had the murals for Scheidenbaum, for Morena. And I haven't seen that kind of, campaigning sloganeering, in Vietnam, you see more of the posters and the banners. It's a very distinct thing. But getting back on track, I do want to ask, before we talk more about the future, is Canadian support as a third party for challenging this and doing it under Kuzma. So first of
Yeah.
all, what's Canada's interest here, and why was Kuzma the mechanism that they used to try to sabotage Mexico's sovereignty kind of focus efforts?
Yeah, I like the way that you phrase it because it was very much, I think, seen certainly domestically here in Mexico as an attack on our sovereignty and our ability to decide that we want to have an independent path, that we want to be able to make a decision like this without having a trade panel decide for us, right? And the case of Canada is very curious and I think very telling when it comes to the issue of GMO corn. Canada might sell a minuscule variety, if not any, zero genetically modified corn to Mexico. So why would it join in on this? Well, there are actually no economic interests being affected here. I think my hypothesis is twofold. One, Canada, as a junior player to US imperialism, often likes to do little things like this to show that it's part of the club, that we're on your side. You know what I mean? And we've seen it in other foreign policy adventures that the Canadian government has engaged in, namely China. The obviously the notorious case of the arrest of the Huawei executive, I think, shows you when they do these things, it's to show the decision makers in Washington, we are like you, we're on the same side, treat us well. So I think that's part of it. But the other part, according to Canada, was that they were worried that this would set a negative precedent, that other goods that Canada does indeed sell to Mexico could also be, according to them, arbitrarily banned because of non-scientific reasons, right? So, of course, this went to the panel, and the panel ultimately did decide that there was not enough sufficient basis. But that in itself is also a revealing exercise because what does it tell us about these panels? Is that they're tilted in favor of the corporations, right? Often people think that these panels, these trade dispute mechanisms are impartial or at least evidence-based. They're not. They're also politically biased. They're meant to favor the penetration of Canadian capital, in this case, into Mexico, so that it can continue treating it as it has historically as a market for it to be able to sell goods and then repatriate those profits, right? So the fact that Canada joined in, I think, is really, really quite telling and unfortunate because the truth is Canada is now learning what it means to have to face down somebody who's threatening your sovereignty, who's threatening your ability to decide independently about your policies domestically. And again, I want to emphasize what I said at the beginning, right? This isn't just, some food item, right? This is a major staple of our diets, part of our culture, our history. You mentioned, seeing some of the arts on the walls here, you will see murals depicting the importance of la mazorca, right? The maíz, the corn in Mexico. It's not just protecting the countryside. It's not just this concern around the health impacts, but also because what it represents for Mexico and Mexicans. And I'm really glad that the government has actually taken this on. And it's unfortunate that Canada has joined in on this crusade because I think their motivations are ill placed.
So, what ways does Canadian foreign policy target Mexico in the modern era?
So I think you need to think about things as using the framework of imperialism, right? Canada is a junior imperialist power, but an imperialist power nonetheless. And so its foreign policy is going to be guided by the interests of Canadian capital. And I think capital in general, right? Because sometimes, like I said, it does things to show to the international bourgeoisie that Canada is a safe place for capital and the Canadian state won't interfere with the accumulation of capital. I think if you think about who are the major economic actors in Canada? Well, it's a lot of natural resources, lots of manufactured goods, the auto industry, things like that. But it's also a major player when it comes to mining. And that's always a good one to look at when you want to think about Canada, Mexico. It's not exclusively, the only feature about the Mexico-Canada relationship, but it is a pretty important one, right? It's not a mistake that so many of the world's mining companies are headquartered in Canada. It's because there is an entire, legal, political, economic edifice that has been constructed in order to favor these interests of the Canadian mining companies, basically so they can skirt accountability, so that they can repatriate the profits without incident, et cetera, et cetera. And so if you think about that relationship, I think it's very illuminating when you think about generally Canada's approach when it comes to Mexico, which is viewing it as a country, as a source of cheap labor and as a source of cheap raw goods, right? Those primary products. And so anything that kind of threatens that is also seen as worrisome. Canada has a curious relationship with the world's richest country, right? With the United States, in that it has a very kind of similar relationship in that its economy is very much integrated and dependent in some ways on the US economy, but it is an advanced, industrialized, advanced capitalist country. And Mexico is a much poorer, much
I would
more
jump in to say not so industrialized anymore.
not so
That's
industrialized, not
really changed
anymore.
since NAFTA, but we are very financialized. But
Financialized,
I
of
don't think
course,
that
the
really
financial
means
sector.
advanced, right? To be honest with you.
Right. But in the idea, sort of the idea I'm trying to transmit is that, Canada's seen as a wealthy, developed country, right? To use that terminology, whereas Mexico is it's a developing country, or it's a middle income country, right? Which has great inequality, although there's significant inequality in Canada as well. And there is a deliberate effort in the world system to kind of keep countries in their place, right? They don't want to see Mexico emerge from that middle income category, right? We were talking about Carter not too long ago in the U.S. because of his recent passing, right? And one of his Secretary of State, the name escapes me for the moment, but he famously said, "We can't have a Japan on our southern border, right? They don't want to see Mexico like that." And Canada very much views the same thing. They want to keep it in that kind of very cornered position so they can continue to super exploit the workers here and continue to extract natural resources in order for them to be finished into other products, the value added goods in Canada or other countries that are similarly allied to Canada. And that is the approach. And it's unfortunate because I actually think in these times, not so much the Canadian government, but certainly the Canadian people should be paying more attention to Mexico in a very positive way. We're starting to see it, fortunately. And there's the conversation has definitely shifted, I think, over the last few years, where people are finally starting to have appreciation for that. And I hope that the Canadian people, your viewers and listeners, will take some time to see the political advancements that are happening in Mexico and not join in on this kind of ruling class narrative about Mexico that is often emanating from the political leadership of Canada, which we saw very recently. I'm sure we're going to get into, right? These
Oh,
efforts
like
to
did you see
basically save themselves.
Doug Ford, the Ontario Premier's stupid comments
Exactly.
about Mexico? But I mean, certainly from the limited knowledge I have in terms of AMLO and his rise, of how many parties he had to go through and work through to eventually be able to rise up to the leadership of the country, and him being able to hand off the Sheinbaum, and he did picked a better successor than even I thought. I thought she would be moderately good, but I mean, she's actually really stepped up, and it's been
We've all
decisive.
been pleasantly surprised, I suppose. I think everybody knew that she wasn't going to betray Lopez Obrador or
Well,
anything of the sort.
I don't think I did, for example. I didn't think, I thought she'd be pretty
But
good, not this good.
she's really taken things to a next level. I mean, she won a bigger mandate than Lopez Obrador, won a supermajority in the last election, allowing her to pass constitutional amendments without having to negotiate with the opposition. And now we're seeing astronomical approval ratings. She's 100 days in office as of yesterday. She actually just gave a speech. The picture behind me is from that day. And her approval rating is now at 80%, which is higher than what Lopez Obrador even enjoyed. It's quite interesting to see this. We're really witnessing what could arguably be the consolidation of a hegemonic force, not just a popular force, but hegemonic, where there's almost no room for the opposition anymore to be able to even dream about a scenario where they can retake power.
Right. So can you just quickly talk about, what reforms have been able to be passed in the days since Sheinbaum came to power?
Sure. So some of them came in this transition period. We have a really long transition period, and actually, it's actually trying to shorten it right now. But I'm going to talk of them in generally, right? So before the election, Lopez Obrador makes a series of proposals. I believe it was about 20 constitutional reforms, and specifically says these reforms are designed to bring back the social character of the Mexican Constitution. The Mexican Constitution comes out of a revolution, It is a product of the Mexican Revolution, and it's full of contradictions, and it's been chopped to pieces. But the essence of it is still there. It's still one that believes in social ownership of goods and the state being an administrator and a redistributor of wealth, of guaranteeing social, economic, and cultural rights in addition to political and civil rights. It's a very advanced document considering that it comes from, the very beginning of the 20th century. And so these constitutional reforms, like he said, were aimed at restoring that social character to kind of elevate them after a period where the reforms that the Constitution suffered were very much in the neoliberal mold. And there's a whole lot to talk about, but there's a couple of key ones. The big one, the one that was the biggest part of the conversation in the election, the one that Morena said, give us a supermajority because we want to pass this, is the judicial reform.
And that's
So,
actually one of the things that I was thinking about earlier because I saw that the Canadian bourgeois press was very upset about these
oh
reforms,
yeah,
right? And that because it harms the penetration of Canadian capital in there because you have the judges that will serve capital at the end of the day, right?
that's exactly right. That's exactly right. There's a theory that I work with, which I call the conservative strongholds. Right, these kind of spaces where, after the election of a popular progressive leftist government, there's a where the conservatives, the reactionaries retreat, where they can still exercise their political power or their economic power. Right, obviously, the heads of major corporations, things like that, the mass media. But one of the key ones here in Mexico that was constantly acting as a barrier to the advancement of the fourth transformation in Mexico were the courts. And so Lopez Obrador proposes this possibility of directly electing judges, which is actually, I know it's not usual. It's something that's little seen in the world, but it's not that hard to think about when you consider the executive branch is popularly elected, the legislative branch is popularly elected. Why shouldn't the judicial branch? And I'm a believer that we should expand democracy as much as possible. Yes, through voting, but also through a real participatory protagonist democracy, like communes that we see in Venezuela as one example. But this is actually a really major step towards also expanding democracy in Mexico. And I think part of the resistance that you saw outside of Mexico was driven by this concern that it could be a bad example for the world, that people will see that Mexico is electing its judges, and suddenly these very conservative judges that often impede progress are not able to do it, because if they do that, they'll get voted out and somebody new gets voted in who actually defends human rights in the country. And so that was a major one. The only one that I really like to highlight one, and this one was led by Claudia Sheinbaum, has been a reform recognizing the collective rights of indigenous communities and Afro-descendant Mexicans here in the country. And what basically that means is that it gives them basically standing before the courts to act as a collective. So if your community operates under traditional governance, which is actually something familiar with anybody who's done work with indigenous communities in Canada, right? Many of them, the Six Nations, for example, that I worked with in, located in Ontario, in that region, they still have their traditional Confederacy governments. In Mexico, if they had that, they could actually make decisions and have those decisions have legal standing. So let's say a mining company wants to come into an indigenous community and that traditional government says, no, our people don't want this. That has standing and actually can be enforced by the courts to say that we will not allow this to happen. It's extraordinary when you think about it. It's actually a product of a very long history of indigenous struggle here in Mexico. It's taken many different forms. Many of your viewers and listeners may be familiar with the Zapatistas, right? The Zapatistas in 94 have this
Yes,
uprising.
that's actually what I was thinking about when you first talked about the indigenous
Exactly.
communities, actually.
Yeah. And so they, as part of the peace process and that of the Zapatista conflict, the uprising, the insurrection of the army in Chiapas, was the San Andres Accords, which was a negotiated peace agreement, which largely asked for a lot of what this constitutional reform is asking for, or actually has implemented now. And it was betrayed, and there's a lot of political history there. The old neoliberal regime didn't want to stand for it. They warned it would lead to the balkanization of Mexico. So ultimately, for political reasons, that didn't advance. But now the political conditions have changed, and so now there is able to do this. And the other one I mentioned, I know I said I would say
I want to
two, but I
mention
want to say
one
one
thing
more.
here, which I think is
Yeah,
especially a crucial importance, is that first of all, in terms of justice for indigenous communities, it is crucial inherently on its own. But if you look at it
yeah,
from a sovereignty perspective, if you look at what's happening, I will bring in China, for example,
sure.
Xinjiang, Tibet, these kind of regions, the minority populations or indigenous populations, when they even if they're treated well, they can be weaponized and bought off. Factions can be
Mm-hmm.
bought off, but especially if you don't treat those communities well, they're absolutely ripe for it. They're absolutely ripe for it. So it's both on the justice and sovereignty fronts. It is a good policy to genuinely
Absolutely.
treat
I hadn't considered that. It
fairly.
does
Yeah.
fortify sovereignty as opposed to leading to the breakup of the country. What it does is unite it
Especially
because
for
it
a
can't be
non-colonial
exploited.
country like Mexico, right? Canada's kind of a
Absolutely.
different question. It's a different thing to discuss, but for Mexico, it certainly yes.
Yeah, yeah. And so just to wrap up quickly on this, of course, this is the first female president that Mexico has had, right? And she obviously has a responsibility to attend to the social debt of women in Mexico. And she's really put a lot of emphasis on establishing equality for women here in Mexico. The speech that she gave in the Zocalo on Sunday has made many allusions to the advancements for women under her government and what still needs to happen. But one of the things she also did was actually passing the Equality Act, basically enshrining equality between men and women in the Constitution. And that's made possible by the fact that we have not a presidente, but a presidenta with an A.
All right, Jesus. So now let's talk about the threats, though. So what is Trump threatening to do to Mexico, and how do these compare to Trump's threats against Canada? Because they are distinct.
They are distinct. He issued them at the same time, right? Talking about issuing a 25% tariffs on all goods coming from Canada, coming from Mexico. And I love talking about this because you could not have a better example of the difference of reaction between leaderships. In Mexico, you had Claudia Sheinbaum take a firm position, issue a strongly worded letter, and in that letter lays out the consequences of going down this path that Trump is threatening, saying that if you do this, you're going to destroy our economies, right? I always mention this when I do interviews about this because it's kind of weird to talk about the free trade agreement and almost in a sense defending it despite identifying as a leftist. But I think we have to recognize that the Mexican economy radically changed as a result of the free trade agreement, right? And if we were to have a radical change very quickly, it would destroy the economy and there would be great suffering as a result. And, Trump is so worried about migration. If you destroy the Mexican economy, watch out. There will be mass waves of migration into the United States. So it's actually in his interest to have a productive, happy, expanding, redistributive economy in Mexico. But well, he doesn't really operate that way, right?
Well, I
And so the
mean,
threat
well,
is
I mean, he just
basically
hypothetically, but I think the interest of the U.S. capitalist class actually is towards the kind of quote unquote open borders, basically to get as many migrants in migrant labor, exploit that
that's right.
labor, use it as a weapon against working people
The
in the
reserve
United
army of
States,
labor, right?
right?
So you
So
have the
yeah. So
unemployed,
so
but
so it's not
also
really against his interest really, but it's against his narrative interests. It's against like the
exactly.
political coalition he's created.
Exactly. And his base is demanding this of him. So I don't think it's necessarily something that he's just going to walk away from. But so he's issuing this threat and it's kind of hollow because there's not really an ask behind it. He's like, until they get the drugs and migration under control. And then that same letter, Claudia Sheinbaum spells out. This is what we've been working on. This is how we've been cooperating. In Sunday speech, she again emphasizes we can collaborate, we can coordinate, but we will never submit ourselves to you. And that firm position seems to have played a whole lot better than Justin Trudeau's position, which has been very kind of servile. He ran off to Mar-a-Lago. And as we know, I'm sure your readers know, right? It cost him basically his position as Prime Minister of Canada. Now he's stepped down. He will soon have to hand over power to another leader, largely be an election. So Trump's threats led to basically the end of the Trudeau government. And here in Mexico, I will tell you this, if Trump has done anything, all he's done is unite the country behind Claudia Sheinbaum. We have a lot of rallies here in Mexico City, and there's a lot of chants. López Obrador was also a very firm defender of Mexican sovereignty. But something happened curiously on Sunday's demonstration that hadn't happened before. We heard chants of Mexico, Mexico. And that kind of chant was spontaneous. And it's a kind of a sense of a fervor of defending Mexican sovereignty and not in a hollow nationalistic way. I don't want to be misheard about that, right? I do think arguably in a country like Mexico, a nationalist position is not actually a reactionary or right-wing position. It's actually a progressive position because what we're fighting for is national liberation, to break free of the chains of imperialism in the way that they constrain us. national sovereignty in the case of Mexico means an expansion of human rights, an expansion of the welfare state. But more simply, it's about being able to choose our own political destiny, right? Our own economic future. And I think if you think about some of the world's conflicts, a lot of that boils down to that, of having that struggle for national liberation, that freedom to chart your own path. I mentioned Venezuela earlier. I write for Venezuela Analysis, although I'm speaking in a personal capacity. Venezuela has been facing this threat of countless Republican Democrat governments of trying to undermine its sovereignty, right? That's its great crime, that it dared to do what it wanted to do with its natural resources, to redistribute it to the population, to its region, to the neighbors, right? And so that's why it's so important that Mexico actually is mobilized and ready to defend Mexican sovereignty, as we saw on Sunday in that demonstration. The other huge demonstration that we had recently with López Obrador was also on the basis of defending Mexican sovereignty. And they had 500,000 people turn out to the streets. Yesterday, ranges from 300 to 400,000 people. I sent a tweet that I said, I found it extraordinary. The Zócalo, if you've been here to Mexico, it's huge. It's one of the largest public squares in the world. You can see it in this photo behind me. And it wasn't big enough. The streets connected to it weren't big enough. We're talking about a population that understands that politics is, yes, voting and supporting the people who implement the policies that benefit the working class, but it's also taking to the streets and showing that backing. So Trump is issuing threats, but he's playing with fire. And the final thing I'll say on this is that, I'm old enough to remember the first progressive wave, the first pink wave in Latin America. What actually I think is often underappreciated about that is that kind of advancement, that unity that we saw amongst Latin America, the establishment of CELAC, the establishment of UNASUR, right, ALBA, all of these different regional blocks, this emergence of Latin America as a geopolitical actor, as a unit, happened during George W. Bush's term. His terrible leadership on the world stage united Latin America. Trump might very well do the same. And I think that's something that is actually, in a way, a positive thing for the world.
And speaking of the contrast between Canada and the US a little bit more, you have, of course, Canadian tariffs, 100% tariffs now on the Chinese electric vehicles. I'm thinking about BYD, for example, which remarkably, even with 100% tariffs, would be pretty much equal to the cost of the cheapest Canadian EV, or again with shipping and everything, even then it's going to be slightly less or 100 or just equal of the cost, right?
Mhm.
Mexico's gone the other path, actually. If I remember correctly, it's going to have the BYD factories
So
in
this
Mexico, right?
this is one of the rumors that has been circulating. That's not true. There is a BYD factory in North America, but it's in the United States. It's not in Mexico. BYD wants to build factories here. They do. They've stated as much, but not for export, for domestic use. BYD has a very kind of different vision, right? It understands that there is going to be political barriers for their penetration to certain markets. But in Mexico, and that's, I think, one of the important things worth highlighting here in this conversation, yes, our number one trading partner is the United States. Yes, we are in the North American Free Trade Agreement, but not exclusively so. Mexico, under López Obrador and now Claudia Sheinbaum, has looked to Latin America, to Asia, to China, to Russia, right? There was all these kinds of diplomatic pressures for Mexico to join in on this anti-Russia or anti-China bloc. And they didn't play that game. They're like, we have our independent foreign policy. We're not going to do that. And I'm very proud to see that's happening, because that is the correct path. Why shouldn't we have positive commercial relationships? And we're seeing a consequence of that. The government has announced a massive multi-billion-dollar investment in the Manzanillo port to facilitate trade with Asia. They built the interoceanic corridor across the isthmus, the little skinny part of Tehuantepec, it's called, here in Mexico, to facilitate interoceanic commerce, right? To facilitate that kind of trade. That's good news for Mexico. And the final thing I would say about that is, right, United States is in this trade war, this diplomatic political conflict with China. China is very much a rival now for the United States. It is a rising economic political power in the world. But Mexico is not that kind of a player. So if the U.S. is engaging with this kind of relationship with the largest manufacturing hub on the planet, right, and causing and wanting to impose, like Canada has, these huge tariffs, Canada playing the same game, well, the manufacturing has to take place somewhere. And a lot of that is actually being invested in Mexico. And before people accuse Mexico of being a backdoor to China, which curiously, Chrystia Freeland was actually one of the ones who said this about Mexico, who may be the next prime minister or the next liberal leader, I saw a press conference with her and they asked her directly, well, what proof do you have? Is there any evidence that Mexico is a quote unquote backdoor to China? And she couldn't mention a thing because there isn't, right? Mexico has a trade relationship with China. Mexico has a certain duty to try to keep Chinese goods from infiltrating the US market via Mexico. I can understand all of that, but that doesn't stop Mexico from pursuing these diversified trade relationships with other countries and other regions of the world, as they rightly should.
So what lessons can Canadians draw from the Morena government, which won't bow to the Trump threats, right? Lessons for movements, I think is the biggest thing in Canada to end off with.
Yeah. So I think one of the things that Mexico has shown is that when you deliver for your base, when you deliver for the working class, and I mean like in a serious way, not piecemeal projects, not poorly thought out social programs, but universal, guaranteed, constitutionally protected social programs that actually reach people, about expanding the welfare state, about actually going after the elites in order to be able to better serve the poor, right? And to use that terminology, one of the famous slogans here is for the good of all, the poor come first. This idea that you should prioritize them does translate into political victories. There's a couple of other elements in Mexico that I think are important to highlight. It didn't just happen because of good policy. If that were the case, then every time a progressive elected, they would never lose again. But also like having a very clear communication strategy, speaking directly to the population. López Obrador and Claudia Sheinbaum López Obrador first held press conference every day, Monday to Friday, every morning. Claudia Sheinbaum continued that tradition, right? Of actually having that communication strategy, of breaking through the media blockade, of supporting independent communicators like you, like the Canada Files, right? I'm an independent communicator and I've been in the National Palace as an accredited media person.
You've asked him questions, right? You've asked AMLO questions.
I haven't had the chance because they end up picking, and I haven't had the chance. But I've been in the room. I have access to
you haven't asked questions
secretaries, right? If I wanted to get an interview with the spokesperson from the Secretary of Foreign Affairs, I could get it, right? Because this isn't just for the old legacy media, right? There's been an expansion and a privileging, if anything, of these independent communicators. That's been a really important thing. But also, and I think this is the thing that I think Canada's purported progressive party, the NDP, is missing. You have to tap into the mood of the population, which is frustrated with the way that things are, right? You can't offer them.
Look, the NDP is great and all, but they're a complete collaborative party. Interparliamentary Alliance on China, IPAC, the big anti-China bloc of parliamentarians. NDP's got some of their people in that. They cooperate.
And not to mention, propping up the liberals.
Yeah, they're complete collaborators.
And so who's picked up that mantle? Pierre Poilievre. Right? He's seen as sort of the anti-establishment resistance guy in a lot of ways, like the way that Trump was. And obviously, his policies aren't going to deliver benefits for the population. Canadians may have to learn that lesson the hard way. But if there had been a force that had been able to challenge that, to canalize that into a strong political force, I think you would see a very different scenario. They wouldn't be polling in third, they'd be polling in first. But they haven't been able to, unfortunately. And unfortunately, it's the most marginalized in Mexico who are likely or in Canada, I'm sorry, the most marginalized in Canada who are going to suffer.
Yeah, the irony of life, right, is that Maxime Bernier, who was a former minister in the Conservative government, is the only Canadian politician who's talked about multipolarity or talked about some sort of rational engagement with Russia and China, right? Who would have thought 5 years ago that Maxime Bernier would be the only one? It's such a weird timeline we're in. Yeah. It's a good time. It's a good timeline.
And Mexico has shown, right? Like Canada has hitched its wagon to the United States. That's why it doesn't want to talk about multipolarity. It doesn't want to see a multipolar world or another pole emerge. But Mexico has a very similar relationship to the United States. We are very, very close, but we do bet on a multipolar world, right? It shows that the United States neighbor can pursue that path. They should consider it because it's showing that it is quite effective.
For sure. Well, I think it's a great place to leave off this interview. So, Jose, how can people keep up with your work?
Yeah, so the first thing I would say is follow my podcast. I co-host a podcast called Soberanía, Sovereignty in Spanish, the Mexican Politics Podcast with Kurt Hackbarth. We analyze on a weekly basis, usually comes out on Tuesdays. Mexican news and politics in English. So if you're curious about Mexico, check out our podcast, subscribe on YouTube. It's also on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. And learn about Mexico directly from us. We're both based here in Mexico, giving you that perspective in English that we think is sorely lacking about Mexico. And on an individual basis, you can follow me on social media at Granados Ceja, my last names, anywhere where there is social media, Instagram, Twitter. It's usually where I'm most active. And of course, I look forward to meeting more of your viewers and listeners and having more of these conversations.
Fantastic. And to the CanFiles audience, if you appreciate the journalism that's being done, please do consider setting up a monthly or annual donation or one-time donation to support the work. If you can't afford to do that, spread the work. That would be greatly appreciated. Thanks, Jose, and thanks to the audience. Goodbye, everyone.